When the tomb of Tutankhamun was stolen from Egypt, the Egyptian population had no recourse to access what was very clearly something that had huge cultural significance to them. When it was taken from them and put exclusively in the British Museum, where it only profited the British, but it only helped the British, it represents nothing but plunder, nothing but theft. If we can prove to you at the end of this speech that we get A, far more reparations to get these sorts of cultural artifacts not being stolen from them, and B, even at taking affirmative to a negative at their best, we get more utility out of these sorts of artifacts in the first place, we win this debate. A few points I've set up before two main pushes. Firstly, what do these scientific rarities look like? We see like the example of T-Rex bones, moon rocks in the motion. I think more broadly we can think about scientific rarities as objects which are used to help further somebody's understanding about the world around them, about their environment. Insofar as to say that T-Rex bones are a scientific rarity because they help us understand the world of the Jurassic era, etc. Moon rocks are scientific rarities because it helps us understand about space. In that exact same mechanism, things such as cultural artifacts, things such as tombs of pharaohs, things such as like spears that were seen in like African tribes, etc., all had scientific value because it gave us the ability to understand what the world was like in the past, which then like gives us scientific knowledge about what the world is likely to look like in the future. Secondly, the way that these sorts of artifacts are currently being sold is that A, they're currently sold to the highest bidder. That means either somebody discovers those scientific rarities, in which case there's a bidding war over that, or you have archaeologists, or rather billionaires, specifically buy plots of land to then like hire archaeologists, to hire excavators to explicitly search for those scientific rarities to begin with. What that means is that in the vast majority of instances, these scientific rarities are very expensive because it's very difficult for you as a university or as a researcher to gain access to that rarity when you have a billionaire who's trying to make profit out of that, being able to spend huge lump sums of money. Think about the amount of money that that the British Museum sells to like private investors in order to try and get as many scientific oddities as possible. What then does that mean? It means that a negative can't stand up here and claim we can get both, insofar as to say that research that, like at this status quo, are currently oftentimes locked out of being able to access those sorts of rarities in the first place. Okay, two main pushes. Firstly, a reparative principle. Secondly, on utility. On the reparative principle, we tell you it represents theft when a cultural artifact is taken from a country. Why is this true? This is true for a few reasons. Firstly, that cultural artifact holds significance, like a huge significance to that population. That is to say, the tomb of Tutankhamun probably shouldn't belong to whoever owned that plot of land that it was found in. It ought to have owned the Egyptian population. That is to say, that hugely significant artifacts such as the ruins found in Babylon, etc., things like pots, things such as pans, that hold a unique story about that civilization, probably belongs to the people who benefited from said civilization. So what then does that mean? To assume that that artifact then belonged to whoever owned the land, and that person who owned the land is then able to sell it to somebody who is then able to do things such as make a profit off of it, obviously represents theft. But then secondly, even if that wasn't the case, notice what goes into sourcing these artifacts in the first place. That is to say, in the instance in which billionaires buy pieces of land, hire excavators, etc., they often do so by forcing these sorts of individuals to work under very hard conditions that don't end up actually receiving a fair share of the profits made from that in the first place. This is intrinsically true so far as imagine the fact that in the vast majority of developing nations, you have a hugely cheap labor force that is continually being exploited. And then finally, and more importantly, think about where the profits or the benefits of said artifact flows to. That is to say that when you buy this for quote-unquote educational purposes, and you either put it in a private collector's room or in the British Museum, the benefits of that only either A, go to that private collector who's able to look at it, or B, go to some other country who's never had a principal claim to that artifact to begin with. Why then was the comparative so much better? The comparative was so much better in this debate for a few reasons. Firstly, if these sorts of artifacts are expensive, there was no incentive for things such as universities, for things such as researchers, to own said artifact. It is far more beneficial for them to rent that artifact, use it for scientific analysis, use it for research, and give it back to the country it came from. But then secondly, and more importantly, there is no need to buy an entire artifact when the vast majority of scientific analysis looks at things such as carbon dating. It looks at things such as figuring out the composition of what the actual artifact is made of. You never needed the whole artifact to do that. You only needed high definition scans. You only needed specific sections of that artifact. And then that I, as a researcher, never needed to invest huge amounts of money into buying that artifact, but either A, I could rent it, or B, all I had to do was take some small section of it. To that respect, the comparative is obviously far, far better. Second thing then to notice is what this motion gives us fiat to do. That is to say that the motion tells us that we ban people buying it for educational purposes. It means that universities can't just buy it for research and then keep it for education later, because the moment in which they keep it and they aren't actively doing anything with that artifact is the extent where they no longer have any legal right or legal claim to that artifact. It is a moment in which you're able to come and take it back. But then secondly, on utility. Why would this going to be a far more utile way to use said artifacts? Why would this likely to then disparage the entirety of negative case? For a couple of reasons, right? Firstly, notice the extent in which scientific education is propagated through the use of these artifacts. That is to say that in the vast majority of instances, these sorts of artifacts, these sorts of rarities, etc., are being bought by museums and then being put in museums. Few points on this. Firstly, the types of education that museums give to individuals is really broad. That is to say that I go to a museum to learn that the moon exists. I go to a museum to learn the sort of fundamentals of the solar system. I don't go to museums and learn the intricacies of cellular structure. I don't go to a museum and learn the intricacies of molecular analysis, etc. What then does that mean? It means that I never needed that moon rock to begin with. That is to say that it is very viable for me to gain some sort of educational access with things such as models of a moon rock, or an animation of that moon rock. I never needed the physical moon rock to begin with for that to hold some sort of educational purpose. Why was the comparative not going to be true for research? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, research, unlike education in this instance, is likely to be far more specific. That is to say that I, as a researcher, aren't buying a moon rock to learn how the moon, whether or not the moon exists, or whether or not the tides are impacted by the moon. I'm buying a moon rock to do specific things, such as radiocarbon dating, such as high chromatography analysis, to understand specific things, right? That is to say, if you read a thesis, if you read a scientific paper, it is always going to be about some specific thing about a moon as opposed to some general idea. And with that, it wouldn't do for you to just have some sort of animation or some sort of model, because you need to know very specific information that was only accessible when you had that thing in the first place. So what then does that mean? It meant on utility, it was a far more utile way to use said artifact by having it go to research. Notice the wording of the topic. These are rarities, right? You can't have both insofar as to say there's not a readily accessible version of it, insofar as to say that research probably has a benefit on society, allows us to understand things, insofar as to say that we can gain educational access elsewhere. You never needed those things to begin with. Okay, one final note before summary. The one final note that I want to talk about here is in relation back to that reparative principle. Insofar as to say that at our very worst, if negative wants to stand up and say this is going to be identical to what happens in the status quo, that these universities are just going to take said resources for cheaper than under the status quo and never return them, why then was it still better comparatively? It was still better comparatively because they're able to use those sorts of resources to give information about that culture. So that means that that Egyptian person knew more about their own culture, knew more about that civilization in a way that was never available under the status quo. If you believe in a world of reparations, if you believe in a world of utility, if you believe in affirmative, I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.
The first thing I want to start off in this speech is a little bit of clarification, because the vast majority of that side affirmative case relies on things like culturally significant artifacts, which we would suggest is likely not in the scope of today, and that's for three reasons. The first thing to explain is that although the two fields are nowadays quite integrated, obviously there is a distinction between the field of science and the field of things like history and anthropology, for example. And we think the examples as provided in the info slide probably indicate that this debate probably is far more about things like the natural sciences. But we would point out that the burden on side negative in this debate obviously is not to defend the sale occurring in all instances, in cases where the deals might be predatory. So obviously the lowest burden we have to accept under our side is that we can obviously just include carve-outs for particularly culturally significant artifacts, although we will extend beyond our burden to suggest why this would even be okay in those instances. The second observation I would make then is that this obviously knocks out a lot of what their team has to claim, because we think that scientific artifacts are obviously part of a very shared sense of human history, where we look at the age of the Earth, for example, or obviously in the cases as subscribed to by the info slide, a side negative is totally okay with defending the moon people or the dinosaurs in this debate. That broadly seems fine, and we think that side affirmative has a pretty big burden in proving why we care strongly about those forms of artifacts in the debate. So, given that analysis, let's move into the first part of the speech, which is just just going to explain why we get significantly more research funding under our side. I'm going to start this by explaining and characterizing the ways in which these sales are currently done. So let's firstly look at what we are likely to sell under our side of the house. And we think it really looks like three things. The first thing we would say is that it probably looks like items we have a large excess of. And obviously those items might be scientifically rare in the sense that there is a low frequency of them, but we would say that obviously you can have things in excess of what you need in order to research and understand the history of an item, and we would be totally okay with selling those things off insofar as they did not provide further scientific value. That probably looks like things like moon rocks, where we kind of determined the composition of the moon a few decades ago and haven't realistically gotten any other significant benefit out of those artifacts. But even to the extent where we have to defend the sale of unique objects, we obviously would only do so after which point at which we had extracted maximum research value from those items. That broadly seems fine. If we fully understand the scientific context behind a set of pearls, for example, that we were totally okay with selling it off in those instances because we got no additional scientific value. How will we likely to sell these? Obviously, in the most simple instances, it probably looks like an auction of some sort where you just sell off the rights to the highest competitive bidder. But there are obviously a set of stipulations we are able to put in on these sales, and we think museums often do this. Firstly, it looks like selling with a research license. That is, you enable these researchers in order to access those private collections for the purpose of research, even though the deed to the object might be in a private collector's name. But even if we had to defend the sale outright, we think there also exists a set of regulations on museums when they engage in these sales, things like the accessioning laws, which are particularly impactful. The first of which looks like, for example, laws surrounding replenishment. That is, if a museum sells a given artifact, they typically need to be able to prove that they have other artifacts that fulfill that requirement in reserve in order to prevent the decay of scientific contribution. Secondly, you often need to sell at market price or above with really strong protections against things like conflicts of interest. And lastly, we think the fact that it occurs through an auction in and of itself is something which makes these goods incredibly competitively priced. It's really unlikely you undersell them and you probably get a lot of monetary value. And that's amplified for the reason that the sets of individuals buying these artifacts probably look like really, eccentric billionaires who have particular disproportionate interests in science, because this is the set of individuals who are most wealthy and have the most capacity to buy these artifacts in the first instance, because it's a set of people who value the goods for their inherent scientific value and therefore have strong incentives to preserve the longevity of this object, because it is a set of individuals who value these items for the reputation and status that it brings them. And this is obviously really indicative, because we would identify that the vast majority of this set of billionaires actually often include clauses that cause these objects to be donated back to museums and scientific institutions upon their death, suggesting that this is a set of individuals which, even if we had to defend the worst case of sales under our side, probably would take strong actions to preserve these objects in relatively good ways. And that has a set of really important impacts in this debate, because the first thing to say is that we just don't actually lose a particularly large amount of scientific impact for the reasons we described. These valuables are not incredibly scientifically valuable, and they are relatively well preserved at the point at which they are in a private collection. But as side Affirmative also seems to concede, obviously these are items which garner a huge price on the auction floor, and in doing so we think we are far able to fund forms of science in really, really good ways. What does this look like? The first thing we think it looks like is that you often just get funding towards research and future extraction of scientific goods in the first instance. And obviously this debate really only exists insofar as we get access to those rarities at all. So our side is the one which at least has some amount of artifacts to work with, while their side never gets the funding to engage in those forms of archaeological digs in the first instance. We would suggest that even if we had to concede to some principal harms to selling off culturally significant artifacts, we at least get more of those artifacts to show individuals in museums and maintain cultural heritage, which seems like a net good. The second thing is we get much more funding to preserve existing cultural artifacts. Knowing that a huge problem with many of those artifacts under the status quo is that they're subject to degradation and decay, because museums literally do not have the money required to preserve them. So their side might have ownership over all of the artifacts, but will let them slowly decay over 50 to 60 years. Our side maybe has to sell one or two of at really high prices, but in exchange are able to keep the rest of them in well-refrigerated rooms subject to scientific research and scrutiny. The third thing to say is that obviously this is a way of uniquely activating buyers when we promise to give them ownership, because that's a very specific and unique form of interaction with the object that those individuals are able to subscribe to. They feel very deeply connected to the success and history of the excavation project being engaged in by those scientific laboratories. The final thing is that obviously we just show that you probably are able to sell a lot of the important, unimportant shit, and the claim side Affirmative might make is that maybe if it's so unimportant, why would they sell for high prices? We would observe that there is a distinction between what sells for high prices on the market, where billionaires are most invested in things like the largest or the prettiest sets of artifacts, while scientists might care more about the uniqueness and specific longevity of a given artifact, which suggests that we are able to sell off a set of really unimportant goods for significantly high prices to the benefit of science writ large. And that obviously is a huge benefit in the debate, insofar as you care about our understanding of where we came from, our history, as the side affirmative team seems to suggest. Our side is the one that activates this to a far greater degree. Secondly, we think you get far more interest in science, and that manifests through two lenses. The first is that you get much more interest in science insofar as the existence of the auction and the sale of artifacts for high prices connotes a sense of value to science in a way which is incredibly materially tangible, and that things like just a general social value on science is unable to do so. Because when you understand the fact that these goods can be rare, can be really important to history, and can be cool and sold for incredibly high prices in really high-profile auctions between really public-facing figures, that is something which attaches a lot of value to scientific research. Makes it more likely individuals subscribe into concepts of science, makes it more likely they buy into funding those forms of research, because they understand it's a field which extracts a lot of value. But the second observation we would make is that oftentimes, even in cheaper cases, things like the sale of moon rocks, which are, is something kind of the average person can buy actually on eBay if you know where to look, those are often very useful with respect to encouraging young people to get into science, right? And that looks like, for example, if you have a kid who's really interested in science and space, and you as their parent choose to buy them a moon rock to encourage them to further engage in that sphere, they feel really connected to science because they have a piece of the material history of scientific of a scientific expedition. That's obviously an incredibly powerful way to encourage that child's interest towards the scientific field, and activates all the sets of benefits we get from more young entering into the industry of science, doing more research to find out more about where we came from, the natural world, in ways which materially improve everyone's life. We think that is obviously an incredibly important benefit in our domain. Science, at the end of the day, probably shouldn't be kept behind the closed doors of museums. Everyone should be able to have access to it. And insofar as we explain the way in which we allow those people to access it, it's not through the desecration of science, but rather just spreading the word and making more people invested. That seems like a great thing.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, if the vast neoliberalisation of my public services have taught me anything, it's that big business really makes life better for everyone they get involved. And panel, that's fucking ridiculous argument from Affirmative that negativists presented us today. That for some reason, if we get these business interests and monetary interests involved in science, we're just going to create a better world for people. That's complete bullshit, okay? So let's cover a couple of things. Firstly, on pieces of characterization. Secondly, let's talk about what happens to scientific research when you get big money involved. And thirdly, let's talk about whether we get more people involved in science, because I think that is a kind of a very important metric in this debate. So firstly, characterization. So negative comes up here and they try to tell us that the biggest issue is that history and science are completely distinct from one another. I call bullshit on that, actually. I'll give you a couple of reasons. First and foremost, these objects in and of themselves, history itself is very important for various reasons. For example, knowing the history of how Earth has developed, different conflicts, etc., is very important to our understanding of other scientific research areas too. That it actually helps us to understand, say, conflicts and how, people developed and lived during those times. That's very important for scientific development because it helps us understand the world and where we live in. Secondly, what Leo largely talked about wasn't just history, but was also including other areas of science, mainly anthropology. We think that's extremely important to understanding this debate. And thirdly, that even if for some reason negative is correct, what we tell you anyway is that these objects are significantly important towards these communities, that they're significant within their own right, and as such need to be considered in this debate, because that is where the delta lies here. Whether this goes to say for research purposes towards say researchers within universities to help understand these cultures and to collaborate with them for that, or does it go to private investors and museums to put behind glass areas? So let's actually talk about the monetary aspect of this that negative talks about a lot. So what they tell you is that, firstly, that a lot of funding comes from private investors. That's fundamentally untrue. It largely comes from university grants as well as government grants. At the point which what this means, there's a couple of flow-on impacts from this consensus that negative, even if a negative is true, a couple of flow-on impacts. First and foremost, what this means is that you're not going to have a lot of research funding from the government and from these from university bodies. Why is that uniquely bad? Because what that means is, firstly, the big reason why this is bad is it means that I can't imagine that billionaires and stuff are going to start funding research onto very important areas. It's going to be areas that they really care about. They want more dinosaur bones in their dinosaur bone collection. They're probably going to start funding research on that. Say maybe instead of saying the histories and cultures of people within of indigenous peoples, for example. But what this also means is that it becomes extremely expensive to actually fund this research. Why is that going to happen? Because let's just say, right, let's give you a simple narrative, right? Let's just say like 2 billionaires start fighting for this, start doing a bidding war towards these pieces of like artifacts, right? What is going to happen is that researchers to get their hands on this, to actually be able to involve themselves to research and say like dinosaur bones or moon rocks, for example, what's going to fundamentally happen is that it becomes far more expensive for these universities to actually get those things that are very important. And so, but why is it so important to actually get that? I think the big reason is that there's actually a public interest in towards this, that we think that the public actually deeply cares about the scientific discoveries that are made through research, and as such, to deny them this and to just allow bidding wars to occur, which Side Negative seems to promote, is a far worse outcome for the general public. This is very important towards this debate, because what it means is that a lot more people is just the utilitarian principle itself, right? That far more people benefit on our side of the world than theirs. Okay, and I think the biggest, most devastating that's destructive to their case is that you actually reduce the variety of research that happens on their side of the world. Why is that? Well, because at the point at which billionaires start funding their research, as I told you before, they're going to start funding for specific purposes. But what that means is that they're going to fund it for like their own interests and like things that they want to display in their collection. Even if it's done by universities in a world where these sales exist, what happens is that they're probably going to prioritize research that gets them to be able to do the bidding wars, to like get more profits for themselves. What that means is that they're going to like tailor their research towards market growth. That they're going to say like, oh, dinosaur bones are sought out by collectors, so we should probably research into dinosaur bones and help uncover some things. But why is that very bad? I think 3 reasons. First and foremost, our understanding of humanity and of the scientific world is just significantly reduced because that becomes like very much wheelbarrowed into a certain area. That is ridiculous in a sense. The main reason being is because firstly on the utilitarian principle of understanding, but also secondly, to be able to understand certain aspects of like our scientific consensus helps us towards the future. That's like really that scientific consensus and this idea of understanding is fundamentally good for our humanity in of itself, and to be able to understand certain things. At the point which you restrict that, you restrict the ability to be able to do a lot of things. All right, cool. Now let's touch upon this last metric, is the idea of who gets more people into science. Negative tries to tell us that the big reason they win is because at the point in which you see all these big sales happening, that like you're going to get more people interested because they're going to look at dinosaur bones and like even in museums. We think that's fundamentally untrue. The reason that is that for that to occur, you need to have like people interested in science in the first place. Why are you going to have less people interested on their side of the world? Because less people are going to be able to like access research and to access understanding of these issues. And secondly, that these and I think they put the cart before the horse here, in which they try to tell you that for some reason, that like if I just look at a moon rock, I become really interested about moons. No, it's probably the other way around. That like you got really interested into moons, into like all these other geological, scientific aspects, and then you got interested into those artifacts. That is the way that it was driven. Now, what I tell you that is uniquely debate-winning to our side is that the biggest thing I think that we have pushed here, right, is the utility point, right? On this side that we give you is the utility point. That fundamentally, at the point which we just have, at the point at which we allow, so what Leah already told you basically, which is that at the point at which we allow, God, sorry, I'm losing. Okay, so at the point which we allow like universities to far more easily get their handling and to get access to this for research purposes, what happens is that they are more likely to share it. Why? Because a billionaire isn't keeping it behind a glass door to use to show off to their rich guests. No, it's probably that they're probably going to share it around because they're very much interested in the scientific development of these artifacts. What this means that it's far more likely that they'll give it to other universities or other researchers to be able to better understand this, which actually increases our understanding of scientific aspects, which probably means that unlike what a negative tells you, where science only really, just having these artifacts known increases it, what rather happens is that research into this area probably means that more people are actually interested to learn about these aspects and to learn about these artifacts in and of itself. As such, because of this, because we get more scientific interest, because we give because of the reparative principle, and because that we keep science alive and well, we clearly win this debate. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna firstly start with this reparations argument because I think it's the least illegitimate one, and if I can knock it out of the water once and for all so they can't revive it at third, then the power speaker on my team can spend the rest of the day actually winning the debate. So, in terms of reparations, cultural artifacts, even if you don't believe like the topic reading or the fact that, for example, the topic says ban sale for non-scientific and educational purposes, which means they can't support selling it for cultural purposes and returning it on their side. Anyway, there are a number of reasons why they don't actually achieve the outcome of reparations. The first thing to explain is that their characterization is of objects that were stolen, which means they were not sold in the first place. If it is the instance that something has been sold by the original owner, for example, Egyptians selling, tombs of pharaohs and all that kind of stuff, I would say that is perfectly legitimate because people with ownership of those items can obviously make trade-offs and choices about whether they want to derive economic value for it. For example, see Indigenous Australians who own plots of land, who obviously reserve some land for cultural practice and others for mining royalties that they sell at. The second thing to say is that this is a prospective debate. It is unfortunate that a lot of colonization happened in the past, and a lot of objects were plundered. This is largely not something that happens now out of really, really hope, which means banning the sale from henceforth doesn't really solve the issues in the past in terms of reparations. The things that are plundered have already been plundered. Thirdly, we would say that the sale of these items and the facilitation of a market is actually what facilitates the return of this. This is, firstly, because people who have high cultural, like if you have like a random rock that is brown and then an indigenous group really cares about it, but we don't really care because we have no cultural association with it, that indigenous group or the government of that indigenous group has the highest idiosyncratic value on that thing and thus is likely to be the highest bidder and is likely to get that thing back. But often, it's actually the inverse for their side, which is to say that the justification of scientific value and preservation prevents the return of these things. So for example, the Greeks asked for the Elgin Marbles back from the British Museum, and they literally offered to pay for the transportation and everything. British are like, no, we don't think you can preserve it really well in Athens. We preserve it better in the British Museum, and that's a justification that they keep using. But lastly, banning the sale on their side doesn't generate an incentive to give back. Their best attempt at a mechanism is to say, well, if you can't get money from selling it anymore, they might as well just give it back. But obviously you can get a lot of money from just keeping it, right? Like the British Museum owns loads of money from people just like coming in, seeing it, getting tourist dollars, paying ticket entrance fees and all that kind of stuff. So obviously it is still rational for these evil actors to keep these goods, which means that they're not going to give this stuff back. Which means this side consciously fails their own reparative principle. Now onto the actual debate about scientific commodities, but note the latter half of mechanisms still apply to cultural goods, even if you take them at their best case. We explained that the sale of commodities is extremely beneficial because Jacky explains the context of an extremely underfunded and under-resourced archaeological field that is crucially reliant on profit from their sales from the kinds of enthusiastic donors that are enthused from the fact that they can get a piece on their hand on this kind of thing. And that we explained that archaeologists and scientists generally have a good ability to distinguish between scientific value and cosmetic value and like economic value, which means they can sell things that have less scientific value, generate the most research from the things that they actually keep. They have two responses to this. The weaker response is the idea that, well, there's already a lot of funding that comes from university and government grants. Obviously, this is uncomparative. If you believe that obviously these things have scientific value and we get more money from donors, that is obviously good. But the second thing to say is that the kind of sciences that involve physical artifacts are comparatively underfunded. And that is because things that don't involve physics, let's take two examples. If you do English literature, it's very cheap to fund that because you don't need to like fly across the country to do an archaeological dig. You just like read Shakespeare and write some stuff. Or if you're doing things like economic research, which might be a bit more expensive, at least that has really important government and economic applications, which means there are strong public incentives to fund that stuff. The problem with moon rocks and T-Rex fossils is like, everyone has a morbid curiosity of things. Obviously there's a public good, but in the same way that art sectors are underfunded, there's just not that like immediate short-term imperative to have like an application of these T-Rex fossils to our modern-day lives, which means these kind of things are underfunded, plus the fact that these things are obviously very expensive, because digging up fossils is a very expensive time-consuming task, which means that the funding that we get from selling these things is crucially important. I think the better and probably the best material in their speech by far is the idea that it gets more expensive for archaeologists and scientists to get their hands on these objects, because once you have a private market, that raises the price of these things in a bidding war, and that means it's harder for us to get these things. I assume that's your best material. There's three responses to this. The first thing to say is that the vast majority of objects are dug up by the scientific experts and the archaeologists in the first place, which means they're the sole and main beneficiaries of the price being high, because they're the ones selling it for a high price to private bidders, which means they get a lot of money from it. And the reason why you must believe this is true rather than just an intuition pump is that obviously archaeology is very difficult. Archaeologists know where to dig up these things. These things don't come up randomly. But also these things are often occur in very inhospitable terrains or are very buried deep underneath the earth. And the reason why you must believe this is true is because for something to be preserved for a really long time, it can't be out in the open. It has to be in like a bog or some like really deep desert like ground area for that thing to be in the kinds of conditions of preservation, which means you need particular tools and expertise to get that thing out, which is why the majority of these things are found by the scientific community and then sold to private bidders, so the price going up is a benefit to us. But the second thing to say is that even if it is the case that, maybe random people come across this, there's two other things. Firstly, where random people come across it, obviously, if this thing has high scientific value, the governments or those groups have a high incentive to buy this thing because there's scientific value, or if they can't buy it, they can at least, as we explained in our setup, get a research license where they're like, well, you can keep this thing in your private collection, but let us pay a bit of money so we can come in and check up on the rock and map it and get a digital copy of it and all that kind of stuff. But lastly, even if that was not the case, I would explain that where the price is high, it actually creates a good incentive to find these things in the first place. Because like when a random construction company, for example, plows over ground and then runs into, say, the ruins of an ancient city, right? Under their side, when the government is paying shit all for it, right? They're just gonna run over the rest of those relics, and that's the relics gone to history. But under our side, when the private bidders push the price up, there's an actual incentive to just not run over those things and then like actually look out for those things, look out for fossils and all that kind of stuff, and bring them to the forefront, report when they exist, because at least you can get some money for it. So given that, I think we get massive amounts of fundings, and their push are not enough here. The last issue is on the public interest in science. We explained public sales generate a lot of interest because of the spectacle of the auction, because the value that people put, because your mum buys your moon rock and that's a really cool gift and it's really cool and all that kind of stuff. The only response they have to this is, well, no, it's the other way around. You get into science first, and then once you're into science, then you buy the moon rocks. I guess this is kind of true, but I think people being meaningfully invested in a way that means that they're actually likely to donate or contribute is contingent on them having some form of interaction. For example, like I can be sympathetic towards animals if I read them about a picture book, but I'm more likely to sign up to join a dog shelter or like donate to the WWF if I've gone to a zoo and patted the animals, or I own a dog myself. So that real interaction we explain, when someone can own a piece of that thing, is the thing that drives people to meaningfully contribute rather than just be like kind of interested on their side. The last thing they say is, well, it's really bad for public interest because billionaires will kind of like lock these artifacts behind glass, something like you can see through glass, so I assume that's not a problem. But the actual thing is like, we would explain, firstly, Jacky's characterization explains that where things have a lot of like public or scientific value, those are not likely the things that are likely to be sold. Like museums display the most important things and sell the excess that they otherwise wouldn't display. But if it was super monumentally important, billionaires usually buy these things for bragging rights and for social credit, which means they have large incentives to display it publicly, if not publicly, for at least a decent fee so a lot of people can see it and still get the benefit of that public exhibition. For all these reasons, very proud of Social Place.
Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The way we're going to get ahead in this debate is by proving to you that banning the sale of artifacts to private investors or private collectors is the best way for us to gain the largest amount of utility from these artifacts in the first place, but also make it more accessible to people that these artifacts have oftentimes been unjustifiably taken from in things that represent theft, in things that represent plunder. The first thing I want to do is deal with that principle of reparations, because second net comes up and says that they frankly defeated it. And the way they do it is by saying that, in the vast majority of cases, these aren't stolen, people sell it to other people. But no, who are the kinds of people that do sell it? They concede this to the fact by saying that it's Western archaeologists, it's Western scientists that go into these places, dig it up, and then sell it off to, like, the British Museum, for example. But we also told you at Leo that oftentimes it's billionaires that often fund people to go into these sites, buy up swaths of land, and then dig it up themselves, and then accrue the economic rent out of it. We told you that it represented plunder to the point at which you took artifacts away from people, and it doesn't even have to be culturally significant artifact. It can simply also be like T-Rex bones or dinosaur bones that might have had some form of like significant impact, some sort of significance to the communities in which it was taken from, because that community might have seen that as culturally significant, as mythological or religious in some form. We think that even in those instances, it was still plunder because it represented taking something away from someone without giving them proper reparations for it. They then said that then they then say on that is that when you do have a market here, you make it accessible for people to get it back. Number of responses here. The first is that when the price is high, as they so admit that it will be, that it makes it really inaccessible for people from smaller communities, disadvantaged communities, to ever have access to it. How do you ever get $1 million to buy back an artifact that someone else can obviously outbid you for, when those $1 million are far harder for you to earn, is something you never had access to? But the second thing to note is that you can auction. The second thing to note is that you can also just like donate it. I don't think we never stood against donations. We were against the sale and banning the sale of it. It's also possible that once you can also then donate it back to individuals if you so felt that way. But thirdly, I just don't think why the British Museum would ever want to sell this back to people in the first place. The last thing to note here is on upkeep, because they say, you're going to be able to upkeep it better because you have the British Museum. I don't understand why that's the case. I think the Greeks are just as capable in keeping their marbles well upkept. But more importantly, the kinds of things that we stand for on our side is on research, which is to say that when you know that you're going to derive some sort of research value from this, you're going to have an incentive to keep it up well in the first place. You're not going to let it just rot in the basement of your campus, because you know that this is something that's valuable, that the research you conduct in this can have meaningful impact in your understanding of the world around you. That probably meant that you'd still have upkept. I don't understand why that was a big thing. That meant that at the end of the day, when you still buy the fact that in the vast majority of instances, the way these resources or the way these artifacts are sourced are kept, are plunder, and the fact that anthropology is still science and that there is still donation, that means that you can give it back to people, the principal harm still stood. It was something that still remains standing at the end of this debate. The next thing to note about is on research. And Affirmative's push here is to say that researchers still get access to research through things like licenses, or you can even sell this to those researchers and do it. Like 6 pieces of responses here. The first is on saying that you get licenses, which is contingent on that billionaire wanting to give those licenses in the first place. Why would a billionaire who has spent so much money on that artifact ever want other people's grubby hands on it when they've spent tens of billions of dollars on it? The second thing to note is that if it is an auction, I think even when you're reselling the things that you don't need, I still don't understand why other billionaires wouldn't want to auction it for it. So even if there is a secondary auction in this case, even if as a research institution, if you wanted to buy that, you would still have to auction against other millionaires or other billionaires who've had far greater capacity and far more resources to outbid you in getting that. The third thing to note is that even if that is the case that you do get licenses, I think the kinds of people that get access to those licenses are the select few universities. Maybe Harvard and Columbia get it, but Monash probably doesn't get it. Probably UNSW doesn't get it. The point at which that's true, that you only, and that's precisely true because billionaires only want the best of the best to ever have access to things that they spend a lot of money for because it's valuable. They only trust the best of the best, which means only the select few researchers ever get access to it. The rest of us are fucked. But the fourth thing to note is that even if you get access, you have to be careful because it's not yours. You can't necessarily do the things that you wanted to do with it because obviously you don't have ownership with it. Fifthly, sometimes you might not even have full access to it. You might have to come in at separate times. That might not coordinate. That's bad. But sixthly, I think this is probably the worst thing to note here, is that you might not simply be allowed to do certain types of analysis. You might not be able to put that artifact into an MRI machine or break it up and actually study its cell components. I think to the point at which that inhibits your ability to conduct that research, you're far less able to actually gain utility from it. The point at which you don't allow people to have like private ownership, and this ownership of these artifacts can only be for research purposes, we told you down the bench that you get far better utility.
Why is that? Because first, now people are more accessible to these, can have higher access to it. The reason behind this, we told you, is that you break down this auction process because now you can't have private sale of it, which means that it's far less, the value of these artifacts aren't inflated, even if other research institutions are bidding for it. I think the capacity across research institutions are fairly similar, which means it's still far more accessible for these institutions. The second thing to note is that researchers can now just use it better because they don't have to worry about, oh, I'm playing with $1 million worth of thing. This is an incredibly valuable thing that if I fuck up is like $1 million loss to my university. But thirdly, I think it's just harder to get research if you have to worry about the resale value of that. Because by their own mechanism, if the way you get research funding is by reselling the artifact after you've done research with it, you have to be very careful in the conditions of that artifact. Because simply no one wants to buy a broken piece of T-Rex bone when you could have bought an intact one instead. That probably meant that you didn't get the benefits that they stood for in this debate. The last thing to note here is on their claim and their push about how this gets utility within the larger community. You get more people buying into science, you get more funding. First, we told you down the bench that the vast majority of this funding comes from government institutions or universities themselves, and people who generally want more research done in this field. We don't think that's affected to the point of which they can't own these artifacts. But second, I think if their push on normal people are far more important. Normal people have a higher willingness to push for higher funding for these research simply also doesn't stack up. Because we told you that one, the reason you would want a moon rock for your birthday is if you were interested in science to begin with, but it was things such as fascination, the education you had to begin with, and other alternatives that could have also drummed up that same feeling of encouragement and enthusiasm. Because you could have also just looked at a video of it and been fascinated by, oh, what is on the dark side of the moon? Are there aliens out there? What was the history of the Earth before we came about? That probably meant that it was never clear why having access to that moon rock in and of itself was the tipping point to get that encouragement to begin with. That probably meant that the point at which they weren't able to prove that down the bench on their side, that it wasn't necessarily that important, and we could get away with having that alternative, to having an alternative fake moon rock, or even animations of a moon rock, and still get that same utility, still get that same encouragement on their side. Even if you don't want to believe that, at least on our side of the house, the rocks and the stuff you use is better utilized, because now you can actually conduct more research on it, more meaningful research on it. That can be researched by a vast majority of people who can probably get access to more things. It might look like being able to look at other pieces of rock and get more out of it in terms of your understanding of what that rock looked like, of maybe finding a bacteria on the moon that probably points to extraterrestrial life. On our side, you get far better utility, you get reparations. It's a much preferable world. Vote negative, affirmative.
You're going to need to give me a 70 this debate, because this debate was already won by such a large margin for my speech. I genuinely don't think I've got much to add, but I will nevertheless try my best to expand this margin. The first question I'm going to ask them is, what is better for science? We explain that we get far more money for research. We say the sale of scientific rarities is good because proceeds are often going to fund more research to do things like preservation. What are side feminist responses? At second act, they tell us private interest in research is very bad. Few responses. Firstly, we probably contend money in research is broadly good, especially in the context we want to talk about things like anthropology, things like prehistoric life, or things just like what is going on in the moon, because currently, even though government and university funding exists in this world, it is not allocated to these historical issues, because people care more about outcomes now, which is why you get more funding into things like cancer research, you get more funding into things like AI safety, which is why it is important that the researchers have a way to make money in the first place, and not that it is just to sell off a bunch of scientific rarities they no longer need to use, and again use that money and translate it to something which is quite good. But the second thing to note here is, I think they misunderstand the way in which private interests operate. It's that private interests don't necessarily dictate what is being researched, and you do like dodgy things like tobacco research. We're just saying you sell it to them, and then you can use the money to do what you want afterwards. The second and better kind of push there is to say that, well, if you're able to sell, private collectors are always going to be able to outbid scientists, and that is going to be bad. I think this actually misunderstands the context and how excavations occur and how these sales occur. Because the vast majority of excavations which exist in the world are done by scientists, are done by government-funded archaeologists, which therefore means when they mine something up, the person who gets first dibs on the artifact or on the scientific rarity is the scientist themselves. Which is why if they see something and it's particularly cool, particularly novel, they just don't have to sell it, which is why there is no bidding process. The only context where their side exists, which is to say, is when like a rich guy comes and buys a plot of land and hires a bunch of people to work there, and they take the thing afterwards and they take it for themselves. There's a few observations as to why we're still able to get a better outcome in their side. We explain instead of mitigation, which is say you can rent it to scientists for them to research. You can get scientists to pay for a research license to do so. What do they say? Well, they go, this relies on billionaires' goodwill in many of these circumstances. The first response here is to say, we think that it's actually quite likely that billionaires will have a lot of goodwill, because they're the ones who already paid for things like excavations. These are people who uniquely care about cultural artifacts, cool fossils, and moon rocks and the like. But more so, secondly, if you really believe that billionaires only care about profits, they probably will let science study it, because when they get a better understanding of such an artifact, they're able to increase the price and value of it, so that if they want to sell it off in the future, they're able to get more money for it, or alternatively, it increases the value what they have, which is why the interests are going to be aligned. The second thing they say here is that, well, maybe you're going to there's going to be an auction for the license. And so, well, there's an auction for the research license, at least it occurs between researchers who have similar purchasing parity, you know, that's broadly fine. Or secondly, it can simply be done in like a private negotiation between the scientist who's interested, and they can negotiate privately with the person who owns it. The third thing they say is that, well, even if under your side it goes to researchers, it only goes to the Harvards, Columbias of the world. At that point, I really don't care, because at least researchers have it, and at least are able to produce valuable research as to what is able to enrich our understanding of the world. They probably also have the best capabilities to do so, which is why they're probably the most efficient researchers in these instances. And once again, we do not believe that is harm. In the rare off chances that this billionaire guy just wants to keep this fossil at home and to show no one else in the world, we're happy to bite a trade-off. We think it is deeply unlikely, and it happens in the most narrow of circumstances, and that is why we're happy to support this. So what is the impact of this argument? Clearly, if they want to do a business debate on research and utility, we are able to still get that. We get more research and more utility because of the money we have in the area. And the important thing to recognize here is that in the most extreme circumstance, even if the researchers had every single artifact in the world and everything at their own disposal, one, they probably didn't have the effort, the manpower and time to go through all of it. But secondly, in absence of having funding for them to be able to have livelihoods, to be able to spend the time looking at things which a lot of the world doesn't actually care that much about, that is what is actually way more important, is the ability to have that money to support such research. And we're happy for some kind of artifacts to be gated away, as broadly speaking, as long as this area is able to thrive and able to survive. That is how we win on research. The second way they try to argue this is they go, well, under our side, we reduce access, because a lot of cool stuff is now gated away. Few things here. Firstly, if something is useful science, clearly the public cannot access it anyway, which is why their side kind of gets owned there too. But secondly, access is never going to be important, because insofar as museums are the main vector by which you display these cultural artifacts, museums often contain hundreds of thousands of objects, artifacts, artwork, etc. that are not on display in any given time, for the very reason that museums and galleries have a very limited space, which therefore means the vast majority of people cannot access the vast majority of the museum's collection, which therefore means there really isn't actually a universal benefit or universal right to be able to access everything possible, more so as long as they're able to access sufficient things, and that is probably sufficient in this debate for this issue to not matter. The third thing to note here is just that this was never a threshold by which to hold any form of transfer and sale of goods in any context. The closest they get to this is suggest some of the stuff is really, really unique, but this thing literally does not apply to the least replicatable of goods, which is things like art. Just say private collectors can still own Monets, even if they're incredibly valuable. There was never a reason to prevent the sale of such a thing there. But even if you were to look at access is remotely important, here's why you weigh as being less important than research outcomes for two reasons. Firstly, seeing something is clearly less important than people being able to research something and being able to get a better understanding, which allows them to enrich the world in these instances. Secondly, secondly, I think people's enjoyment of many cool, novel, sciencey or cultural stuff is actually quite superficial in many instances, because I do not actually know the meaningful difference between David going to a museum and seeing a cool T-Rex versus like a really, really unique fossilized womb of a dinosaur, with a baby dinosaur inside. I think it could be cool, but like the coolness factor is already achieved by just seeing what already exists anyway, which is why the marginal increase to seeing maybe cooler things isn't something you outweigh very high in space. So at the end of this, in terms of the question of utility, side negative wins this by quite a landslide, and that is how we already win this debate. But now for the last 2 minutes of debate speech, let's resurrect this discussion of the principle. So on reparations, let's see what the new things we heard from Stan for the third affirmative were. The first thing they came here is that often billionaires are incredibly exploitative because they hire locals and then they put them into bad working conditions, etc. The first thing is that this argument makes no sense for the very reason you're often not paying your sweatshop worker to excavate an incredibly precious and delicate fossil in the first place. You probably have to hire a bunch of scientific experts, people who actually have experience in archaeology because of the technical expertise, because of precision and preservation you need to do so, and these are the people who are uniquely able to be paid an appropriate wage, which is why this exploitation argument does not work. The second point they make here is, well, it's quite bad because when people give it up, they aren't able to buy it back because it's already price gouged so much through an auction mechanism. The first thing to observe is that insofar as important, I think you just don't sell it. But secondly, I actually just don't think that it's nearly as meaningful as what they say it is. Which is say maybe they dug up a pot and it's old, they already sold it. At the point where they've sold it, I don't know why like a pot is something which is particularly meaningful to this indigenous community or the locals who live in that area. Maybe they care about things like statues, maybe they care about art which they've worshipped like centuries onwards, but simply having a pot from a prehistoric civilization that centuries ago is actually unlikely to affect the meaningful livelihoods of a person or for them to form an incredibly important cultural attachment to. So once again, I think this principle is made at too high a level. And the third thing to note here is that this reparations principle is weird to me in many instances because firstly, I think it only narrowly applies to cultural artifacts, like things maybe Indigenous Australians own. It doesn't really apply to T-Rex bones because I don't know why an Indigenous community cares about T-Rex bones. But secondly, I actually don't understand how this is like theft in any way, right? Because we don't need to defend theft or plunder. We can just defend people wanting to sell it and being compensated an appropriate amount for what they've chosen to sell to them. They claim that it's being sold to the West and that it's like colonialism. But what about things which are dug up in the UK and are sold to private collectors? Clearly, once again, this narrow information of principle. But secondly, I think compensation is the most important thing. Colonialism is theft without any compensation, which is why this principle calls.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now move to the reply portion of the debate. Speaking under the half, speaking on reverse, therefore I'd like to invite back.
Let's look at the two worlds of this debate through the lens of the extraction of a scientific artifact. And let's start at the point at which that artifact is excavated, in a process we explain to you is one which is incredibly expensive, technically demanding, and overwhelmingly done by scientists. And that is the first way in which side negative wins this debate, because we explain the only way that occurs is at the point at which these institutions receive adequate funding for a field which is overwhelmingly funded by the whims of eccentric billionaires who uniquely feel like they can access and connect with the material under our side, rather than through the dearth of public funding that Kat explains to you. And that in and of itself is sufficient to win this debate, because think closely about all of the impacts side affirmative tries to explain to you, things like cultural loss or damage or degradation. And obviously the acquisition of the artifacts in the first instance is logically prior to any of the impacts that they can claim. Individuals extract no value from cultural artifacts at the point at which they remain buried in the ground. We get no scientific information at the point at which we are never able to acquire any of those goods. Clearly then, even if you were to believe the worst excesses of this side affirmative team, you must still give the debate to our team. But once the goods are dug up and are in the possession of scientists, what happens? We explain to you that even though these goods are in the possession of scientists, things are not as easy as just trying to study them in the abstract. Because to study the goods in and of itself is an expensive program, one which requires you preserve the goods for a very long time, hold them in effective forms of storage, use expensive tools to extract value out of them. And that uniquely is also provided for by the market mechanisms both teams in this debate seem to agree on. And their team claims that perhaps researchers struggle at the point at which market price increases and can't acquire these goods. But we explain to you that oftentimes it's the researchers who extract the goods in the first instance. So the high value of the market price means we realistically have to sell very few forms of artifacts or scientific goods under our side in order to meet the cost burden that the study of these artifacts holds. And that obviously is comprehensively defeating of this affirmative team, because even in their ideal world where they get perfect possession of all those artifacts, at the point at which those artifacts degrade in the long term without the requisite funding, it is clearly better we sacrifice some small portion of them, even insofar as billionaires are likely to trick them to value. What happens at the point at which they are sold for those few artifacts? We explained to you that billionaires have really strong incentives to firstly preserve them very well, because a billionaire would not engage in scientific investment unless they were truly authentically invested in that science. There are better ways to gain status and repute, things like art, things like investment, etc. Clearly this is a world where those individuals really care. But even if they not, Kat explains to you that there are market incentives for these billionaires to allow things like research licenses to be sold at relatively accessible prices. Because an evaluation and appraisal of your market good raises its value when scientists identify more unique details of that good, which suggests these goods are relatively accessible to the vast majority of researchers in circumstances we care about. What then does this team have left? The only real argument you might believe at the end of this debate is the idea individuals, you and I, the average person, should have public access to these forms of artifacts. But we explained to you, firstly, through the lens of museums, individuals can only ever do that insofar as the museum is well funded. And the museum itself only really displays a small set of artifacts, in which case it is deeply unclear why we get any marginal change towards public interest access. But uniquely, we extend the margin even further when we explain to you the impact that owning your own little slice of the scientific endeavor of mankind brings to individuals. The inspiration that having your own ownership of an authentic piece of moon rock might bring to you, extending long into the future. The will of the people to engage in science was substantially improved under our side of the house. We got much more out of those scientific endeavors.
As long as you buy that the tomb of Tutankhamun held some scientific importance, whether it be being able to analyze the climate of thousands of years past, whether it be being able to analyze rock formations, and as long as you also buy the fact that reparative principles became the most important thing in this debate, insofar as to say that their own mechanisms shoot themselves in the foot, the negative have no path to victory. So there are three things in this debate in order of decreasing importance. That is, the most important thing was that reparative principle, then it became research value, then it became public access, museums, etc. Firstly then, why was the reparative principle the most important thing when thinking about this debate? Because notice what they tell you, right? The significance of this research when it comes to these sorts of artifacts is likely to be rather limited for a couple of reasons. If you buy the fact that grants are given out based on merit, which is what both sides seem to agree on, and then you also buy the fact that negative stands up and tells you that the state of this sort of research is really dire because there isn't any grants. You have to go out and sell that. Logically, the only thing that follows from that then is that the type of research that is being conducted is very limited in its utility, is very limited in its scope. Notice that it's still more important than public access because you can get public access without those sorts of artifacts, but it is less important than that reparative principle because you're not doing things such as curing cancer, etc. Okay, on that grounds then, why did we win on that reparative principle? We gave you a few things. Firstly, that these sorts of artifacts belong to the entire country it comes from. That is, I as an Iraqi feel huge cultural ties towards the sorts of cultural artifacts that are there in the ancient ruins of Babylon. For Saddam, for instance, back in 1970, to own that sort of ruin and then to sell it to another person doesn't represent the wishes of that entire country. That is to say, that negative stands up and gives you this response of, oh, it's not being stolen, it's being sold off. We say, yes. Who was it sold off by? It was being sold off by incredibly rich billionaires. It was being sold off by incredibly members of the 1% who didn't accurately represent the people that that cultural artifact was important to. But the second thing to note here then is that we told you the benefits of that cultural artifact never was able to flow back to its country of origin. Either that research value never materialized, that means I as an individual who had their stuff stolen never got to understand more about my culture, or the profits of that never flowed back to my country. Crucially, notice the difference here. That is to say that negatives only reply is to say, but you as a country can buy it back. Notice the problem here. You as a country had to then outbid everybody else. As a developing nation had to outbid all these incredibly rich billionaires, you probably had to buy it back for more than you sold it to. If that doesn't represent some form of theft, if that doesn't represent some sort of unprincipled thing, obviously there's something wrong going on there. Then what do we say to you in terms of how we fix this? We tell you we stop this happening in the future. That is, we told you two things at first that went wholly unresponded to. Firstly, that research organizations never needed to own those artifacts in order to do research. That is, there was no incentive to own it if you couldn't keep it because you had to do research on it, so you may as well have just rented it because it's cheaper. And then that second, you didn't need to buy the entire artifact, all you had to do was buy the ability to go there and do some tests in the first place. That was uniquely important insofar as to say that we remove the ability, we remove the incentive to take away these artifacts from countries of origin, to the extent where they couldn't give you anything, any mechanism as to why that didn't exist, negative losses debate. And the second most important thing then was research value. They told you that you're able to get more funding if we gave you 6 responses, right? Firstly, you don't get access because those sorts of things become more expensive. Secondly, you have to rely on licensing that is incredibly rare. Thirdly, the source of licensing is given exclusively to elite universities. Fourthly, you have to be incredibly careful because there are restrictions on what you can do. Fourthly, with a higher price point valuation, you have to be more careful with the types of research you can do. Finally, on public access, this was less important because you could gain that insofar as to say that science is probably good for you anyway. I think a lot of us in this room care about science. A lot of us didn't get a moon rock given to us by our family. We tell you that science is important because of the narratives that come associated with science. That is to say, I'm into science because I like extraterrestrial life. If we're able to get more research, you get more narratives. More narratives means more public access. That means we win on that alone. As long as you buy the fact that reparations is an important thing, we won this debate. I'm incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you all for the debate. It was quite an interesting debate. I think we both enjoyed it. We'll give some general feedback and as a result, go through the reasons for the result. First thing in general feedback, I think in this debate had some quite wildly different conceptions of how sales work, how this is operating, what it looks like. So I think in that case, teams could have maybe spent a bit more time in each other's best characterization or in each other's general characterization to prove why the arguments either work on both sides or still win in both sides. But I think at times the strategy of just pushing back on their own one wasn't hugely successful, in all cases or for all teams. In terms of the, I think otherwise general feedback it was not a whole lot of general feedback. I think probably just responses needed to be a bit stronger. In terms of the result, we had a unanimous decision with the debate decided negative. Congratulations. 4 questions in the debate. The first one is a question of what is in the debate and what we would consider. I think this is a question of this cultural artifact thing versus the scientific thing. I think I broadly lean negative that the info slide suggests certain artifacts like T-Rex bones and moon rocks align more with the scientific thing. So I think I'd probably lean more towards AF. More towards neg. I don't think AF makes some reasonable claims as well to suggest that this also includes there's lots of historical and cultural things that also have scientific value. So I think I'm happy to include them in the debate as well because I don't ultimately think this thing is massively debate determining in terms of whether or not this or the other thing changes it. And this becomes important for AF because they talk a lot about these cultural things are important because of the idea of them being stolen and reparations. And they do make some pretty compelling cases as to why obviously stolen artifacts is bad and reparations would be good. I guess there's a big question hanging around how in a lot of cases this particular model is the way in which we gain reparations for these communities, or is the most effective way, or is a particularly useful way. So I think negative, particularly at second, has a good material on one, they don't have to defend the worst examples of things being plundered and stolen. 2, in lots of cases, it's just unfortunately too late. These things already have been stolen and already plundered. So there's not a way in which this sale suddenly makes it easier for those things to come back to those communities. And also that even if we want, the fact that we can buy and sell things beyond just science and education is a mechanism which we can get artifacts back to those communities. I do agree with Ash's response to say that that's probably on an accessibility ground a bit limited, especially if they're very expensive and the groups aren't particularly wealthy. But if there is no alternative path to get those things back, because if you can't sell them, they just kind of sit in back ends of museums and don't get used or whatever, then it does seem like this is at least a way in which those things can be returned to those environments. I guess the best version of this from AF is this idea of what if a super rich Western person goes in and buys a plot of land and then mines that bird, excavates that land using abusive practices and then takes the stuff away and doesn't fund that local community in an impoverished environment. I think obviously in that set of circumstances, it might be bad, but I think, Neg still has enough reasons to suggest why there's likely to be a small set of circumstances. The first being that we have to pay for the land, so that's indeed a benefit, and that local communities and countries can make decisions to sell that land. I think, point example, Indigenous groups parceling away some land for culture and some land for mining rights, but also that like the type of technical work that needs to be done means you can't just use really like slave labor and abusive conditions because you don't get the quality control that you need, but often also that these these rich investors are wanting to actively preserve these things. They will have an interest beyond just making money if they're willing to spend that much money just to get colored artifacts out of that. But also that lots of the times this stuff is also done by like scientific groups, universities, research institutes, etc., which means it probably takes it even one step away from those groups in the first place. So I think that still leaves the absolute worst case for AFRA, that group still doesn't receive any local money for it. But I think what Neg is able to do is show that like in all other instances of where we buy and sell these artifacts, we get a significant benefit to research overall, that we're willing to trade off that small instance versus all the other benefits here, especially because we can't fix the worst excesses of that being historical with regards to the reparation stuff. So the second question then becomes one about how and when these artifacts are sold. I think this actually really sets things up quite well for Negative by showing a really, a really clear picture of how this world works. And if the world works in this way, then it actually mitigates a lot of the harms that Negative talks about. So Affirmative talks about. What does Negative tell us about how these things are likely to be sold? The first is on types of things that are likely to be sold, and these things are in excess. I think you do a good job at first of dancing around the rarity versus excess of these things. So it's not likely to be things that are particularly being used now. So they've already had their use. So we've got the scientific research out of them. We don't need them anymore. We sell them off in that way. So that probably, I think, mitigates how important a lot of these things are to later clashes around research or things like that. Secondly, they tell us that these things are likely to sell for lots of money, which is agreed to by AF, and then ultimately ends up having benefits later on. Thirdly, they're likely done at auctions, and I think the way they describe the auction process around selling licenses and research licenses, things like that, probably means that they sell in a way that also enables some degree of benefit to be held, if there is still a benefit left of this research of these artifacts, but in often cases isn't, but also that they can still access these things because billionaires are likely to have incentives to loan them back or make them accessible so they can show off and have their ego. I don't think that rules out the likelihood there might be some billionaires who like lock it in a non-glass box so you can't look through and keep it to themselves. But if it is those worst cases, as Neg points out, we're only selling artifacts we don't need anymore, that have done their scientific research, have done their purpose. So at that point, that benefit is like, there's no benefit to having that stuff being stuck around, being held around anyway. I don't think this is largely contested enough from Affirmative. They try and push back to more the land sales aspect and how like it push more around reparations, which we've already dealt with in the first issue. But when we're talking about things that don't exist in that context, I think there's enough engagement from Affirmative as to why those things are likely, why this process either doesn't work that way or still creates, that doesn't work that way. So at that point, I'm willing to believe it works this way, and these artifacts don't have a sufficient degree of value anymore because we've exercised the value of them. Which then I think leads to the next two questions. The first one being what happens to research as a consequence of doing this. I think that the first comment to make about this is if we've already pulled the research value out of these things, there is no additional research value from having these things anymore, other than the money we can get from selling them to fund future research, which I'll come to in the next issue. Secondly, I think they also talk about the fact that if there is still a value, you can access it via licenses, etc. And I think lastly, there's two more things in this issue. The next one is in terms of access, whether it's more or less limited now if billionaires are buying these things. I think even if the access is more limited, I think the comparative pushed out by Negative that like museums don't show most of the stuff they have, probably really means that access is a very tiny benefit, if any benefit at all. But also that if they're being used for scientific research, there's also no access to them to the public or anything like that either. So the access is particularly limited for research already, and the value is already done. The next best claim on research we hear is that it's now bad research that's done or unimportant research. Because billionaires control it. I think it's a bit assertive that billionaires having like their niche interests are necessarily therefore bad, like those things aren't important to research anyway, or they're not useful. But if the alternative is that those things don't get any research or any benefit whatsoever, then like it seems okay that the billionaires are doing this are pushing for this research in this sense. But I think it also misunderstands a bit of the causality of this issue. So I think the idea that Neg pushes back of like, well, you buy the things post them being excavated because they're already done by universities and museums, etc., means that it's unclear just how much the billionaire research is impacting that. If I'm to read in very generously, there's probably I think a claim there made by Second that this directs what universities want to fund then, because they want to fund the things that billionaires will then buy things off. But again, it's unclear why necessarily that is in and of itself a harm, why billionaires only want to research really harmful things or things we don't care about, or that comes at the cost of things we do care about. So I think research is probably fine at this end of the debate, because we still are able to exercise those benefits and gain money off them. Which then comes to the benefits of the sale. I think there are broadly two here. The first one I've previewed very heavily already, and that is just that you make lots of money. And I think the negative explains like, well, why you make that money, but also I think impacts that really well what that money is used for. So firstly, just funding more research, which I think is particularly important. We hear the claim from ACT that you can get money in other ways, things like government grants or universities funding or government grants. That's probably true, but again, there's no reason why this additive benefit isn't also important for adding on to that. But I think additionally, Neg also explains why it is unlikely the government grants and university grants are likely to fund this type of research, given its lack of proximity to what people care about when they care more about like cancer research or things that like have more of a tangible impact on them. So you probably do get a unique source of money here to continue to have more research. And I think it's unclear what the alternative is for having this research on the other side as well. Like if they're not gaining money from this, what other research funding do we have? What other benefits do we gain from this? So if there's no clear alternative or path to achieve this on the other side, this stands as a particularly strong benefit in terms of having this revenue coming through. I think the second big benefit Neg's able to win on this debate in terms of money is just preservation. I think they explain quite well how difficult it is to preserve a lot of these things, how complicated research is, and the fact that you have lots of money now by selling off 2 or 3 really expensive items now lets you fund the preservation of lots more of those items, probably leads to a big benefit around research, access, scientific community, preservation of culture, history, etc., are all in that as well. So I think at that point then the money actually provides a really big benefit that they only uniquely get on side AF. The last one then is on interest. I think this ultimately ends up being quite a small thing in the debate relative, especially to how much time teams spent on it. Neg tells us that like the capacity to see, access, to hold a moon rock adds a lot of benefit to interest in science. I'm not sure if someone on Neg got a moon rock or didn't get a moon rock. There's a bit of trauma here, but I think ultimately it's like after the previous was saying, well, maybe other things come first. You want your interest in science before you get the moon rock. Let's say the moon rock sparks that interest. I think ultimately it's like probably a very marginal issue. I'm willing to believe there might be some people who get that moon rock and are inspired. Is it a huge number of people? Probably not. There's other ways to get involved in science. But ultimately isn't a massive issue that like is debate swinging in any way. So maybe it's a marginal win to Neg, but not a huge decisive win. So ultimately at the end of the debate, this is a useful way for museums to sell off artifacts they no longer rarities. They no longer lead. They've got all the value out of, but generate future value for other research that is good, and therefore negative wins the debate. Hope that all made sense. Happy to give feedback over the social or whatever, but otherwise, good luck for the rest of the tournament for Australs.